The camp's most dangerous German POW vanishes in 1943, leaving a folded uniform and a scrap of pencil-scrawled farewell behind the outhouse door. 30 years later, a backhoe tears into Coal Creek and unearths 2 skeletons where bloodhounds once lost the scent, and the tidy escape story falls apart in a mud-slick instant. Life before the disappearance is ordinary. Roll call, the mess bell, crisp work details under an endless Kansas sky. The discovery feels violently wrong, an officer's ring clinging to a pale hand, an American Guard's dog tag at its side, a skull split as if by something meant to make silence. Tucked among the bones are coded letters and a sealed journal that whisper of a translator's love, a secret deal, and a betrayal planned to look like freedom. Who staged the vanishing? Who betrayed whom? And why was the true story buried until a machine gouged it back into the light? The wind across the Kansas prairie never stops. It pushes through the wire fences of Camp Concordia like an invisible prisoner, carrying the scent of wheat and diesel and something else, the particular stillness that comes when men are caged far from home. November 1943. The camp sprawls low and purposeful against the flat earth, rows of tar paper barracks arranged with the same geometric precision the German prisoners once used to organize their own armies. Guard towers puncture the gray sky at measured intervals. Beyond the wire, wheat stubble stretches to the horizon in every direction, broken only by the dark line of cottonwoods marking Coal Creek 3 miles northeast. Hauptmann Franz Becker walks the perimeter path between Barracks C and the mess hall with the bearing of a man inspecting his own command rather than enduring captivity. Tall and lean, moving with the economy of someone who wastes nothing, not words, not gestures, not the precious minutes between roll calls. His prison uniform fits him differently than it fits the others, pressed somehow. The shirt buttons aligned like soldiers on parade. The American Guards watch him. They always watch him. Private Eddie Marsh, 19 and homesick for Indiana, leans against the corner of the administration building and tracks Becker's progress. Man walks like he owns the place, he mutters to no one in particular. That's because he does. Corporal James Dutton appears beside him, coffee steaming in his hands despite the cold. Dutton has the weathered face of someone who grew up under this same endless sky, who knows its moods and dangers. Everything inside that wire that we don't control, he controls. You see how the other prisoners move around him? Marsh squints. It's true. As Becker crosses the yard, the clusters of POWs part and reform like water around stone. Some nod. A few straighten unconsciously. Others simply stop talking until he passes. The effect is subtle but unmistakable. The deference animals show to the alpha, rendered in human form. I heard he speaks better English than half our guys, Marsh says. Studied engineering in Berlin before the war. Could probably design half this camp better than the Army did. Dutton sips his coffee, eyes never leaving Becker. 3 escape attempts on record, caught every time, but each one more sophisticated than the last. Intelligence thinks he's running some kind of shadow command structure, keeping the prisoners organized, maybe even passing information. To who? That's the question, isn't it? Becker stops near the wire, hands clasped behind his back, and studies the prairie beyond with those pale gray eyes that seem to calculate distances, angles, possibilities. Even from across the yard, there's something magnetic about him. Something that makes you want to either follow him or stop him before he does whatever he's planning next. The mess bell clangs. The prisoners begin moving toward the hall in orderly lines. No pushing, no disorder. Just crisp efficiency that makes the American enlisted men look sloppy by comparison. Dutton crushes his coffee cup. Come on. Major wants everyone at the briefing. The administration building smells of wood smoke and mildew. Major Robert Thompson's office occupies the corner, windows facing both the camp entrance and the prisoner yard. A man who trusts nothing he cannot see from multiple angles. Thompson sits behind a scarred oak desk that came from somewhere else, some other war or some other life. The desk dwarfs him slightly. He's compact, former college football, the kind of hard muscular that's starting to go soft around the middle. His uniform still fits, but it remembers a younger body. 6 files spread before him like cards in a losing hand. Each bears a red stamp. Dangerous. He's reading Becker's for the 4th time today. Hauptmann Franz Becker, age 29, Luftwaffe. Shot down over North Africa, July 1942. Engineering degree, Berlin Technical University. Speaks English, French, some Russian. Designated high-priority observation due to leadership qualities and repeated escape attempts. The photograph paper-clipped to the inside cover shows a man who could pass for American if you squinted. Clean-shaven, sharp cheekbones, the ghost of a smile that suggests he knows something you don't. Thompson flips through the incident reports. September 42, attempt to bribe a guard and acquire civilian clothing. Caught. January 43, elaborate tunnel discovered beneath Barracks C, extending 40 feet toward the perimeter. 6 prisoners involved, but Becker clearly the architect. Caught. August 43, found with hand-drawn maps of the Kansas rail system hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible. Caught. What worries Thompson isn't the attempts themselves. It's the pattern. Each one more complex. Each one suggesting Becker learns from failure, adapts, refines. What worries him more is the report from 2 weeks ago, flagged by camp intelligence. Hauptmann Becker has established regular contact with translator Sarah Mitchell during twice-weekly document review sessions. Nature of relationship unclear, but appears to exceed professional necessity. Recommends surveillance. Thompson closes the file as boots sound in the hallway. Captain Lewis enters, followed by Corporal Dutton and the overnight watch commander. "Gentlemen," Thompson doesn't stand. He gestures to the files on his desk. "Our most dangerous residents. I want extra attention on all of them, but especially Becker." Lewis nods. He's older than Thompson, passed over for major twice. The kind of career officer who knows he'll retire at his current rank and has made peace with it. The translator situation? I had Mrs. Mitchell in this morning. Told her any further contact with Becker outside official translation duties will result in her immediate termination and possible investigation. Thompson leans back, chair creaking. She took it poorly. Think she's compromised? I think she's lonely. Thompson picks up a pencil, rolls it between his fingers. Husband killed at Anzio last year. No children. Lives alone in that little house on 6th Street. Becker's charming, educated. Speaks her language, not German, I mean her language. Literature, philosophy. Things nobody in Concordia, Kansas talks about at the grain elevator. Dutton shifts his weight. You think he's using her? I think he's smart enough to recognize an asset when he sees one, and I think she's vulnerable enough to convince herself it's something else. Thompson drops the pencil. Double the guards during work details. I want Becker in sight of 2 men minimum at all times, no exceptions. That'll strain the rotation, Lewis says carefully. I don't care. That man isn't a prisoner, he's a powder keg. Thompson opens the file again, taps the photograph. And his friendship with the translator. That's the fuse. The briefing continues. Shift schedules, supply shortages, the usual tedious machinery of running a prison camp in the middle of nowhere. But Thompson's attention keeps returning to that photograph, to those calculating eyes. Somewhere in the compound, the dinner bell rings. The sound carries across the prairie, lonely as a train whistle. Thompson closes the file and locks it in his desk drawer. Tomorrow, he thinks. Tomorrow he'll implement the new protocols. Double guards, restricted contact. Maybe transfer Becker to a higher security facility in Oklahoma or Texas, somewhere they're better equipped to handle prisoners like this. Tomorrow. But tomorrow, Franz Becker will be gone. The morning of November 17, 1943 arrived cold and colorless over Cloud County, Kansas. Sarah Mitchell stood at her kitchen window, watching the first light spread across the wheat stubble beyond her yard. Her coffee had gone cold in the cup she'd been holding for 20 minutes. She'd already called the camp at 0630 hours to report herself ill, her voice steady enough to convince the duty officer she had a fever coming on. The lie tasted bitter. In 34 years, she'd never called in sick when she wasn't. Through the thin curtains, she watched a convoy of trucks rumble past on Highway 81, heading south toward Fort Riley. Everything moved south these days. Men, machinery, purpose. Everything except the prisoners at Camp Concordia, locked in their static orbit of barbed wire and boredom 3 miles west of town. Everything except Franz. She'd destroyed the letter he'd slipped her yesterday during the afternoon count, memorizing it first the way he'd taught her. The words burned in her mind now. Tonight changes everything. Tomorrow I become someone else. Trust what we planned. I will come for you when the wheat grows again. Sarah carried her cold coffee to the sink and poured it out. Through the window above the basin, she could see the Anderson farm in the distance, where the work detail would be heading this morning. Franz would be among them. Corporal Dutton would be on guard duty. Franz had been certain of that detail, though he'd never explained how he knew. She didn't ask questions anymore. Questions had died with her husband at Anzio, buried in Italian mud she would never see. The clock above her refrigerator read 0710. Franz would be in formation now, waiting for the count, his posture perfect and his face revealing nothing. She'd watched him master that stillness over the months since they'd first really spoken, the day he'd corrected her pronunciation of Lebensraum during a translation. And she'd seen something flicker behind his gray eyes, not superiority, but loneliness, recognition. Sarah dried her hands on a dishcloth embroidered with sunflowers, a wedding gift from a life that felt like someone else's memory. The $3,000 sat in a manila envelope in her bedroom closet, hidden behind her winter coats. Money saved over 2 years from her translator's salary, every spare dollar tucked away for a future she barely dared imagine. Franz had another $1,500 from his pay as a POW, wages the Geneva Convention guaranteed even prisoners, a detail that made some of the guards bitter. Together, it would be enough to disappear, to wait out the war somewhere the past couldn't follow. Franz said he knew people in Chicago, German families who'd been in America for generations, who understood what it meant to love a country your blood had left behind. She didn't let herself think beyond that. Hope was dangerous in wartime. At the Anderson farm, 10 miles southwest of town, Dale Anderson was already checking the tractor when the army trucks arrived. He'd been working this land since before the Depression, and the arrival of German POWs to help with repairs had struck him as one of the war's stranger ironies. Good workers, though, most of them. Better with machinery than half the boys the draft hadn't taken. The tall one, Hauptmann Becker, had an engineer's hands. Anderson had watched him diagnose a seized transmission in under 5 minutes last week, taking apart the gearbox with the focused efficiency of a surgeon. Unsettling, having that much competence under guard in your barn, but Anderson didn't complain. The wheat wasn't going to harvest itself, and his own son was somewhere in the Pacific, turning Japanese islands into graveyards. Emma had been watching the prisoners too, though Anderson wished she wouldn't. At 16, she had her mother's curiosity and her grandfather's stubborn streak. He'd caught her staring at Becker during the last work detail, and it had set his teeth on edge in a way he couldn't quite name. The girl was too young to understand what war did to men, made them hungry in ways that had nothing to do with food. Corporal James Dutton rode in the second truck, his stomach churning despite the empty roads. He'd barely slept, the $1,500 in his footlocker feeling like it weighed more than the bills should. Half the money, just for looking the other way at the right moment. Half the money to forget he'd ever been assigned to watch Hauptmann Franz Becker repair farm equipment on a gray November morning. The debt collectors in Salina would be paid. The shame of borrowing from loan sharks to cover poker losses would end. And what was the real harm? The war was ending. Everyone could see that, even if they weren't supposed to say it out loud. Germany was bleeding out in Russia, losing ground in Italy. The prisoners would go home eventually anyway. If Becker wanted to skip the wait, wanted to vanish into America the way so many immigrants had before him, who was Dutton to stop him? The man spoke better English than half the boys from Arkansas. He could disappear into any city, become anyone. Dutton told himself this in the rhythm of the truck's engine, the words a prayer against the acid rising in his throat. At 13:45 hours, Becker stood in the Anderson barn, his hands black with grease, rebuilding a carburetor while two other prisoners repaired a broken plow. Dutton leaned against the barn door, trying to look bored while his heart hammered. The other guard, Private Kessler, was walking the perimeter of the property, cigarette dangling from his lips. Becker worked in silence, his movements precise. He didn't look up when Dutton shifted his weight, didn't acknowledge the moment arriving like a train you could hear but not yet see. At 14:30, Becker set down his wrench and straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Corporal," he said, his accent barely noticeable. "I need to use the facilities." Dutton nodded, the script unfolding. "Outhouse is behind the barn. Make it quick." Becker walked past him, close enough that Dutton could smell the motor oil and sweat, close enough to whisper two words. "Thank you." The gratitude made Dutton's stomach clench. 15 minutes passed. Dutton made himself wait, though every nerve in his body screamed to walk away, to never check the outhouse, to let the 15 minutes become an hour before anyone noticed the absence. But Kessler was coming back around the barn. Protocol required checking on prisoners who took too long. Dutton forced his legs to move, crossing the hard-packed dirt to the weathered outhouse. He knocked once, professionally. "Becker, time to get back to work." Silence answered. He knocked again, louder. His hand shook. "Hauptmann Becker, sir?" The wind picked up across the wheat stubble, cold enough to burn. Dutton yanked open the outhouse door. The prison uniform lay folded on the wooden bench. Jacket, trousers, even the shirt, creased with the precision of a man who'd spent his life in military service. The boots were gone. Becker was gone. A scrap of paper sat atop the folded clothes, 4 words in pencil. No hard feelings. FB. Dutton's vision grayed at the edges. This was wrong. This wasn't the plan. The plan was Becker would slip away, would vanish into the Kansas horizon while Dutton claimed he'd looked away for a moment, claimed the German had been faster than expected. This, the folded uniform, the note, this was theater. This was a message. "Kessler?" Dutton's voice cracked. "Kessler, get Anderson. Get everyone. Prisoners escaped." The words set the machinery in motion. Within an hour, the Anderson farm would be swarming with soldiers. Within 2 hours, roadblocks would stretch across 3 counties. Within 4 hours, FBI agents would be racing west from Topeka. But Dutton stood alone in that first terrible minute, staring at the folded uniform, and understanding with absolute certainty that nothing about this moment was what he'd believed it would be. 3 miles northeast, at Coal Creek where the cottonwoods grew thick along the banks, Hans Weber waited in civilian clothes stolen from a sympathizer's donation box. He held Corporal Dutton's service revolver, the one the corporal thought was safely locked in the camp armory, never knowing Weber had lifted the keys weeks ago. His hands didn't shake. God's work never required trembling. He heard footsteps approaching through the brush, lighter than he'd expected. Franz emerged from between the trees, also in civilian clothes, confusion crossing his face when he saw Weber instead of Sarah. "Hans?" Franz stopped 20 feet away. "What are you doing here? Where's—" "She's not coming." Weber's voice was steady, certain. "Neither are you." Franz's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something that looked almost like pity. That was when Weber knew for certain that the letters had been real, that the betrayal he'd refused to believe ran deeper than politics or strategy. Franz Becker was in love with an American, was planning to abandon the fatherland, to sell secrets for asylum and a woman's touch. "Hans, listen to me," Franz began, taking a step forward with his hands raised. The shot echoed across the empty prairie, swallowed almost immediately by the wind and the vast indifference of the Kansas sky. The soldiers came at dawn, when frost still silvered the wheat stubble and their breath hung white in the Kansas air. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, over 200 men spread across the Anderson farm and surrounding prairie, weapons drawn, eyes scanning every gully and windbreak for a flash of movement. Private Eddie Marsh stood at the farmhouse gate, rifle ready, watching farm trucks being searched for the third time. FBI agents in dark coats moved between vehicles like crows, pulling canvas tarps back, thrusting flashlights into wheel wells. "He could be in Chicago by now," Eddie muttered to another private. "Hiding in plain sight," but the FBI didn't think so. Special Agent Warren Talbot stood near the command post, Major Thompson's staff car parked in Dale Anderson's muddy yard, studying a map spread across the hood. His jaw worked a piece of gum with mechanical precision. "Bloodhounds picked up his scent heading northeast," Talbot said, not looking up. "That means he's on foot. And a German officer in civilian clothes can only hide so long in farmland this flat." 3 bloodhounds strained at their leads 50 yards away, handlers struggling to keep them focused as they circled the outhouse for the 100th time, whining. The dogs had gone wild when they first caught Becker's scent yesterday afternoon, pulling their handlers northeast toward Coal Creek with single-minded intensity. Major Thompson stood apart from the FBI men, his compact frame rigid with anger he couldn't direct anywhere useful. He'd warned headquarters. He'd doubled the guard on Becker. He'd even considered transferring the dangerous prisoner the very day he vanished. Now a German POW had embarrassed the U.S. Army in front of the whole state of Kansas. "Roadblocks?" Thompson asked. "Every highway within 100 miles, an FBI agent replied. "State police are checking trains and buses. We've got men at every farm between here and the Nebraska line." Thompson's gaze drifted to the outhouse, its door hanging open. Inside, Becker's prison uniform still sat folded on the wooden bench, almost mockingly neat. The note, "No hard feelings, FB," lay precisely centered on top. "Cocky bastard," Thompson muttered. Corporal James Dutton stood 20 feet away, face pale, hands shaking whenever he thought no one was watching. He'd repeated his story a dozen times. Checked the outhouse after 15 minutes, found the uniform, raised the alarm immediately. No one questioned him. Guards lost prisoners. It happened. But Dutton kept seeing that folded uniform. The precision of it. Becker had stripped naked in November cold and changed into civilian clothes without leaving a trace. Professional. Planned. Dutton's stomach turned. The envelope of cash in his barracks footlocker felt like it weighed 100 pounds. By mid-morning, the search had expanded to a 12-mile radius. Soldiers tramped through harvested wheat fields, poking haystacks with bayonets. Farm wives opened root cellars and barns without complaint, watching grim-faced as strangers searched their property. Everyone knew what a German escapee meant. Danger, scandal, the war come home to peaceful Kansas. At Coal Creek, 3 miles northeast, the bloodhounds went berserk. The creek ran shallow this time of year, more mud than water, cutting through clay banks overhung with leafless cottonwoods. The dogs lunged forward, baying, dragging their handlers down the bank, then stopped. Special Agent Talbot slid down the muddy slope, his polished shoes ruined within seconds. He watched the handlers circle with the dogs, trying to pick up the scent again. Nothing. The hounds whined, circled, sat. "Water," one handler said, pointing to the creek. "He must have waited. Kills the scent." Talbot stared at the thin trickle of Coal Creek, walked its length for a quarter mile in both directions. The creek meandered northeast toward the Republican River, then eventually the Missouri. Hundreds of miles of tributary water. "Get men upstream and down," Talbot ordered. "Every bridge, every farm, every crossing point. If he followed the creek, he had to come out somewhere." They searched for 3 days. Farmers reported no missing clothes, no food stolen from root cellars, no strange footprints in the mud around livestock ponds. It was as if Franz Becker had walked into Coal Creek and dissolved. On the 4th day, the FBI expanded the search zone to 200 miles. Agents interviewed German immigrants in Salina, Manhattan, even Kansas City. Any family with a German name got a visit, their homes politely but thoroughly searched. Neighbors watched from windows, marking who had Gestapo agents knocking on their doors. Nothing. Emma Anderson, Dale's 16-year-old daughter, stood in the kitchen watching soldiers tramp back and forth across the field where she'd seen the German officer 2 nights before everything went wrong. She'd told the sheriff about it yesterday, Becker arguing with another man near the creek after dark, voices low and urgent. The sheriff had written it down, then set the notepad aside and asked her father about supply trucks. Emma twisted a dish towel in her hands. The man arguing with Becker hadn't been American. She was almost sure. The silhouette was wrong, shorter, broader, and she'd heard a few words, carried on the wind. German words. But when she tried to tell her father, Dale had shaken his head firmly. "You saw shadows, Emma. Don't go making this worse with wild stories." So she stayed quiet and watched the soldiers search the wrong places. By the end of the first week, the FBI turned their attention to Sarah Mitchell. The translator lived alone in a tidy house on Concordia's east side, the kind of place where curtains stayed drawn and neighbors minded their business. Agents knocked at 9 in the morning, warrant in hand. Sarah sat on her sofa, hands folded, while they tore her life apart. The forged documents came from a box under her bed. Social Security cards, ration books, driver's licenses, all blank, all waiting to be filled in. The cash was in the same box, $3,000 in neat bundles of 20s. Special Agent Talbot held up a map, marked in pencil with routes south. "You want to explain this, Mrs. Mitchell?" Sarah's face was stone. "I want a lawyer." "German sympathizer," one agent muttered, loud enough for her to hear. "Helping the enemy while her own husband died fighting them." In the interrogation room 3 hours later, Sarah sat across from Talbot and said nothing. The lawyer from Salina hadn't arrived yet. She stared at the table, at her own reflection in the two-way glass. "We know you helped him," Talbot said. His voice was almost gentle, the tone of a father disappointed in a wayward child. "Just tell us where he's going. Mexico? South America? We'll find him eventually, Sarah. Cooperation now might keep you out of prison." Sarah's hands trembled. She clasped them tighter. "Did he promise to send for you?" Talbot leaned forward. "After the war, maybe? New identities, a fresh start somewhere warm?" Her eyes flickered, just for a second. Talbot saw it, smiled. "He's not coming back for you," he said softly. "Men like Becker, they use people. He saw a lonely widow and he exploited that. Whatever he promised you was a lie." Sarah's voice came out hoarse. "You don't know him. I know he's gone. I know you're here, facing federal charges. And I know you're protecting a man who's already forgotten you exist." The lawyer arrived 20 minutes later, and the interrogation ended. But the damage was done. Sarah Mitchell's face, blank, haunted, would be on the front page of the Salina Journal by evening. Local widow aided enemy escape. Back at Coal Creek, a young soldier found something in the mud. A boot print. Partial, almost washed away, but definitely there in the clay bank 15 feet from where the dogs had lost the scent. Major Thompson examined it himself, measuring the depression with a ruler. Size 9, European style. "He came out of the water here," Thompson said, "walked up the bank. Then, nothing. No more prints, no trail. The ground beyond the creek was hard prairie soil that held no tracks. They searched in expanding circles. Found nothing. On November 30th, 13 days after the disappearance, the FBI called a press conference in Topeka. Special Agent Talbot stood before reporters, his face grave. "We have reason to believe Hauptmann Franz Becker successfully evaded capture and has likely fled the state of Kansas. Roadblocks remain in place throughout the Midwest, but our investigation now focuses on interstate and international flight. We are working with authorities in Mexico and monitoring ports of entry in South America." A reporter raised his hand. "What about the translator, Sarah Mitchell?" "Mrs. Mitchell will be charged as an accessory. The evidence of her involvement is substantial." "Has she given up?"
His location. Talbot's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Mitchell claims ignorance of Hauptmann Becker's whereabouts. We believe she's lying." But Sarah wasn't lying. In her cell in the Cloud County Jail, she sat on the thin mattress and stared at the wall, replaying Franz's last whispered words in the supply closet 3 days before his disappearance. "Wait for me where the wheat meets the sky. I am coming home." She'd thought he meant after the war, after Germany's defeat, after things were safe. Now she wondered if he'd meant somewhere else, somewhere she didn't know about, somewhere he'd gone without her. The thought felt like drowning. The interrogation room at the Cloud County Courthouse smelled of stale cigarette smoke and winter rain. No windows, just 4 gray walls, a scarred table, and 2 folding chairs. One occupied by Sarah Mitchell, the other empty and waiting. She'd been sitting for 40 minutes by the clock on the wall, her hands folded in her lap, back rigid despite exhaustion. They'd arrested her at dawn. 3 FBI agents and Sheriff Henley crowding into her tiny kitchen while the eggs she'd been scrambling turned cold on the stove. The warrant was typewritten, official. She'd read it twice but couldn't make the words settle into meaning. Conspiracy to aid enemy escape, obstruction of justice, treason. The door opened. Special Agent Warren Talbot entered first, carrying a cardboard evidence box. Behind him came a younger agent whose name Sarah didn't catch. Both wore dark suits that made the room feel smaller. Talbot set the box on the table with deliberate care, like a man handling explosives. "Mrs. Mitchell?" He didn't offer his hand. "Thank you for your patience." She said nothing. Franz had taught her that silence was its own kind of armor. Talbot settled into the empty chair, adjusting his tie. The younger agent leaned against the wall, notebook ready. "I want to be clear about something," Talbot began, his voice measured, almost kind. "We're not interested in ruining your life. You're a war widow. You lost your husband at Anzio. That means something to us." Sarah watched him. His eyes were pale blue, calculating. "But we need the truth, Mrs. Mitchell. We need to know where Hauptmann Becker is. Help us now, and this goes much easier for you." "I don't know where he is." The truth, spoken simply. But Talbot's expression didn't change. He'd expected the lie. He reached into the evidence box, withdrew a sheaf of papers. "These are rail schedules. We found them in your bedroom drawer." He laid them on the table. Kansas City to Chicago, Chicago to New York, New York to, interestingly, Buenos Aires. He tapped the last sheet. "Argentina, Mrs. Mitchell. That's a long way from Kansas. I've never been to Argentina, but you planned to go. It wasn't a question. With Hauptmann Becker, after he disappeared, I planned nothing." Talbot pulled out the next item, a stack of bills bound with a rubber band. $3,000. That's more money than most families in Cloud County see in 5 years. Where did it come from? Sarah's throat tightened. She and Franz had saved it together over months. His POW wages, her secretarial pay from the camp, every spare dollar scraped from their separate lives and hidden for the future they'd whispered about in stolen moments. But explaining that would damn her faster than silence. "I've been saving since before the war." "For what?" "Security." "Security?" Talbot let the word hang. He withdrew a folded map from the box, spreading it across the table. Red ink marked a route from Concordia south through Oklahoma, Texas, and into Mexico. This was in your attic. That's your handwriting in the margins, isn't it? These notes about border crossings? The map. She'd traced that route herself 3 weeks ago, believing Franz when he said they'd drive south after his release, disappear into a new life where the war couldn't touch them. But she hadn't known he planned to vanish early. She'd thought they'd wait, plan properly, do it legal. "I like to travel," she said quietly. Talbot's patience cracked. He leaned forward, voice hardening. "Stop lying to me. We know you helped him. We know you provided these documents." He gestured at forged identity papers, "and this money. We know you were his accomplice. The only question is whether you were duped or complicit." "I wasn't." "Did he tell you the plan? Did he explain how he'd get off the Anderson farm? Who his contacts were in Kansas City, or Mexico, or wherever the hell he's running?" "I don't know any plan." "Then you're protecting him." Talbot's voice dropped, falsely gentle again. "Sarah. May I call you Sarah?" He didn't wait for permission. "You're not a traitor. You're a lonely woman who made a mistake. He's a trained officer, a manipulator. He used you. But if you help us now, the court will see that. They'll understand." Sarah met his gaze, saw the trap clearly. Admit nothing, and they'd assume guilt. Admit anything, and they'd twist it into conspiracy. Franz had warned her about interrogations, how they worked. Tell them only what they already know. Give them nothing they can build from. "I have nothing to help you with." The younger agent stirred. "We have a witness who saw you and Becker together, multiple times, alone." Her pulse quickened, but she kept her face still. "Translation sessions," she said. "Part of my job. For hours at a time? After camp curfew?" She had no answer that wouldn't incriminate her. Talbot pulled out the final piece. A photograph. Not evidence. Bait. It showed Franz in his Luftwaffe uniform, younger, smiling in front of a Berlin building. Handsome in a way that made her chest ache even now. "Where is he, Sarah?" She stared at Franz's face, remembering his whispered promise. "Wait for me where the wheat meets the sky. I am coming home." He'd traced the words into her palm the last time they'd been alone, his expression so certain. She'd believed him. She still did, despite the fear creeping through her certainty. "I don't know." Talbot gathered the evidence slowly, returning each piece to the box. "You're going to prison," he said flatly. "Federal charges. 4 years minimum, maybe more depending on the judge. And when Becker's caught, and he will be caught, your cooperation today will matter. Last chance." She thought of Franz folding his uniform so neatly in that outhouse, the deliberate care of it. He wasn't careless. He wouldn't abandon her. But doubt flickered. Why didn't he tell me it was today? "I have nothing to say." Talbot stood, closing the evidence box. "Then you'll say it to a jury." He nodded to the younger agent, who moved toward the door. "Federal marshals will transport you to Topeka in the morning. Think about what you're protecting, Mrs. Mitchell. Think hard." They left her alone again. 6 months later, the courtroom in Topeka sweltered under June heat. Sarah stood before the judge in a borrowed dress, her hands trembling as the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. The sentence came swift and final. 4 years at the Federal Reformatory for Women in Alderson, West Virginia. The judge's voice was granite. "You aided an enemy of the United States in a time of war. Your actions cannot be excused by loneliness or sentiment." Sarah barely heard him. She searched the gallery for a face she knew wouldn't be there. Franz, somehow returned to defend her, to explain, but only strangers stared back, their judgment palpable. The marshals led her out through a side door. She didn't resist. That evening, in a room at FBI headquarters 300 miles away, Special Agent Warren Talbot addressed a gathering of reporters. Cameras flashed as he stood beside a map of Kansas, a red pin marking Camp Concordia. "After an exhaustive investigation," he announced, We have concluded that Hauptmann Franz Becker successfully fled the continental United States. Evidence suggests he reached Mexico with assistance, and from there likely proceeded to South America, specifically Argentina, where a significant German expatriate community exists. A reporter called out, "Do you expect to apprehend him? We are coordinating with international agencies." But given the head start and resources at his disposal, Becker has likely established a new identity abroad. The case remains open, but active pursuit in the United States has been suspended. Another question. What about Sarah Mitchell? Talbot's expression hardened. Mrs. Mitchell was complicit in a carefully planned escape. Her conviction sends a clear message. We will not tolerate treason, regardless of the perpetrator's personal circumstances. The briefing ended. The case file was marked closed, subject at large, and archived. Camp Concordia prepared for closure. By 1946, the last prisoners were repatriated, the barracks dismantled, the barbed wire rolled away, the prairie
reclaimed the compound slowly, wheat growing through cracks in abandoned concrete. In Alderson, Sarah served her time in silence. She scrubbed floors, worked the laundry, and never spoke Franz's name aloud. At night, she pressed her palm against the wall and traced invisible words. "Wait for me where the wheat meets the sky." She waited, but Franz Becker never came home. The television glowed blue in the darkened parlor, casting shadows across Sarah Mitchell's hollow face. She sat upright in the hospital bed her daughter-in-law had arranged near the window, the one facing west, toward the Anderson farm 3 miles distant, where wheat still grew in November stubble. "Lung cancer," the doctor said. 6 months at most. But Sarah measured time differently now. It had been 25 years since the trial. 25 years of sideways glances at the Concordia Safeway, whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, children who crossed to the opposite sidewalk when she walked to church. Traitor. The word had followed her from the federal prison in Alderson back to Kansas in 1947. She'd tried Topeka first, found work at a typing pool under her maiden name. But someone always recognized her face from the newspapers. Someone always remembered. So she'd returned to Concordia. Let them stare. Let them wonder. Her hand trembled as she reached for the photograph on the nightstand. Franz in his Luftwaffe uniform. The picture she'd kept hidden during the trial. The one she'd refused to surrender even when her lawyer begged. His gray eyes looked past the camera, focused on something distant. She'd taken it herself. That afternoon in September 1943, when he'd repaired the camp's generator, and she'd found him afterward by the fence, watching storm clouds gather over the prairie. "You have beautiful skies here," he'd said, in English, so precise it sounded rehearsed. In Berlin, the smoke makes everything gray. She'd asked if he missed it. The city, Germany, home. "I miss what it was before." He'd turned to her then, and the distant focus had sharpened. "But I think perhaps home is a place we make, not a place we remember." The television droned. Watergate hearings. Something about tapes. Sarah didn't care. History had already ground her fine enough. The apartment door opened. Her daughter-in-law, Patricia, carried groceries in brown paper sacks that rustled with Midwestern efficiency. "I brought the soup you like, and some of that rye bread from Hoffman's." Sarah nodded. Patricia tried. She'd married Sarah's son, Robert, born in 1949, named for the husband who died at Anzio, without knowing the full story. When she'd learned, after the wedding, she'd simply shrugged. "My father was in Bataan. He says war makes monsters of good men and heroes of monsters. Who am I to judge?" Mrs. Patterson called again. Patricia unpacked cans into the narrow kitchenette. "Wants to know if you'll talk to her journalism class at the high school." "About the camp?" "No," she said. "No." Sarah's voice cracked. "I have nothing to say about it." Because what could she say? That she'd loved an enemy? That she'd believed his whispered promises in the translation office? His careful English sentences that held more truth than any interrogation had extracted? That she'd saved every dollar for a life that never came? Franz had memorized her schedule. He knew she took her lunch at 12:15, ate alone on the bench behind the motor pool where the cottonwood provided shade. He'd found her there in July, presented her with a sketch he'd made of the camp at dawn, the guard towers silhouetted, wheat beyond the wire rendered in delicate pencil strokes. "For you," he'd said, "to remember this place wasn't only sadness." She'd kept that sketch. It hung in her bedroom now, framed in drugstore glass. The money had been real enough, $3,000 in a coffee tin beneath her floorboards, discovered by the FBI men who'd torn her house apart the day after Franz disappeared. They'd found the maps, too, routes she'd traced in library atlases, careful plans for a drive south. The forged papers had been Franz's work, documents he'd somehow created in the camp print shop where he'd been assigned to run the prisoner newsletter. "This will get us to Mexico City," he'd explained, showing her the identification cards during one of their final meetings. "From there, we wait 6 months. Then Chicago, or maybe New York, someplace large enough to disappear. They'll search for you. They'll search for Hauptmann Franz Becker, escaped German officer." His smile had been gentle. "They won't search for Frank Baker, Czech immigrant, or his American wife." She'd believed him. God help her, she'd believed every word. The FBI had twisted it all. Special Agent Talbot, square-jawed, righteous, certain of his narrative, had painted her as a Nazi sympathizer, a lonely widow seduced by enemy charm. The prosecutor had been worse, suggesting she'd married her first husband just for cover, that her real loyalties had always been with the Reich. 4 years. She'd served the full sentence because she wouldn't confess, wouldn't confirm their version of events. In Alderson, the other inmates had kept their distance. Even criminals had standards, apparently. She'd emerged in 1947 to find Concordia emptied of its German prisoners, the camp already being dismantled. Wooden buildings sold for scrap. The guard towers toppled, the wire rolled up and hauled away to some other purpose. Only Coal Creek remained unchanged, the same water, the same cottonwoods, the same red-winged blackbirds in spring. She'd walked there the day after her release, stood on the bank where the bloodhounds had lost the scent, stared at the slow current and whispered to the prairie wind, "Where did you go?" No answer came. None had come in all the years since. "You should rest," Patricia said, pulling the curtains against the November dusk. "I'll warm the
soup." Sarah closed her eyes. The morphine they'd prescribed made sleep come easy now, made the edges of pain soften into something bearable. But the dreams remained sharp, always the same. Franz walking toward her across wheat fields, his gray eyes fixed on hers, mouth forming words she couldn't hear. She'd reach for him, and he'd dissolve like morning mist, leaving only the wheat bending in wind that smelled of rain. The telephone rang. Patricia answered, her voice dropping to a murmur. Sarah caught fragments. "Very weak. Yes, hospice nurse comes tomorrow. I'll tell her you called." Too many people calling now. Deathbed vigil courtesy. The town that had shunned her for decades, suddenly eager to make peace before she slipped away. But Sarah had made her peace long ago. Not with Concordia. She owed them nothing. With Franz. She'd stopped waiting for him in 1952. 9 years of watching every stranger's face, every man with gray eyes or precise posture. 9 years of flinching at accented voices. The hope had died. Slowly, painfully, like something starving. What remained was simpler. She'd loved him. He'd promised to return. He hadn't. Maybe Argentina was warm. Maybe he'd found another woman, built the life he'd imagined. Maybe he looked at photographs sometimes and thought of a translator from Kansas who'd been foolish enough to believe in futures. Or maybe, and this thought came more often lately, he'd never made it past Coal Creek at all. The clock on the wall ticked toward 7. Patricia brought soup on a tray, helped Sarah sit upright, waited patiently while trembling hands managed the spoon. Outside, the November darkness settled thick. First frost was coming. You could smell it in the air. "There's going to be a reservoir," Patricia said, settling into the chair beside the bed. "Big project. They're damming Coal Creek, going to flood the whole valley for irrigation." Sarah's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "They say it'll bring jobs, help the farmers." Patricia smoothed the blanket. "Construction starts this winter. Should be finished in a few years. The valley. Coal Creek. The last place Franz's scent had led. The last place anyone had tracked him. Soon it would all be underwater. 40 feet deep, the newspaper said, a mile wide, erasing the creek bed, the cottonwoods, the exact spot where the bloodhounds had circled and whined and given up. Progress, Sarah whispered. I suppose. Patricia took the half-empty bowl. You want the television on? No, just the window. Patricia opened the curtains again before leaving. Sarah gazed out at the darkness, at the direction where Coal Creek ran invisible through the November night. If Franz was out there somewhere, under Argentine sun, he'd never know that the last trace of his escape was about to vanish beneath engineered water. He'd never know she'd died still branded with his crime. If he was out there at all. Sarah's eyes grew heavy. The morphine pulled her down toward sleep, toward the dream wheat and the gray-eyed ghost who never spoke. By Christmas, the doctor said, she'd likely be gone. By spring, construction would begin. Both erasures felt the same, inevitable, final, already half complete. Her last thought before sleep took her was the memory of Franz's voice, that afternoon by the generator. Home is a place we make. She never made it. Neither, she suspected, had he. 3 weeks later, Sarah Mitchell died in her sleep. The Concordia newspaper ran a 4-line obituary that didn't mention the trial. 14 people attended the funeral. Patricia buried her beside Robert Sr., beneath a simple headstone that read only her name and dates. By the following November, groundbreaking for the reservoir had begun, and the first excavators rolled toward Coal Creek, their diesel engines drowning out the wind. Tommy Chen doesn't notice the ring at first. The backhoe's hydraulics whine as he drags another scoop of clay from the creek bed, swinging the bucket wide to dump it on the growing pile. November cold seeps through his work gloves. The radio in the cab crackles with static and fragments of Johnny Cash, barely audible over the diesel engine's rumble. He's been at this for 3 days now, carving a trench through what used to be Coal Creek. The reservoir project will flood this entire valley by spring, 1,500 acres of Kansas prairie transformed into a recreation lake. Tommy's crew has another week to clear the channel before the concrete pour begins upstream. The creek itself disappeared 2 months ago when they diverted the flow. What remains is a winding scar of mud and exposed stone, littered with 50 years of debris. Tommy has already pulled out rusted farm equipment, rotted fence posts, a 1940s Chevrolet somehow wedged into the bank. Yesterday they found 3 milk cans and what looked like the frame of a child's bicycle. He lowers the bucket for another pass, teeth jarring as the steel digs deep. 8 feet down now, into clay that hasn't seen daylight since before he was born. The bucket fills, heavy and resistant, then lurches sideways as it catches on something solid. The backhoe shudders. Tommy eases off the hydraulics, frowning. Probably a boulder. They've hit a few already. Stubborn granite deposited by glaciers 10,000 years ago. He repositions, tries again from a different angle. The bucket scrapes across something that doesn't feel like stone. Tommy kills the engine. In the sudden quiet, he can hear his own breathing, the distant honk of geese heading south. He climbs down from the cab, boots squelching in the clay. The trench walls rise on either side, slick and brown. At the bottom, the latest scoop has left a ragged gouge. Tommy slides down carefully, grabbing a handheld shovel from the toolbox. The clay is dense, almost waterproof. He works at the edge where the bucket scraped, clearing away chunks with his gloved hands. His fingers brush something smooth, cold, curved in a way that makes his stomach drop before his brain catches up. Not a boulder, not metal. He stops breathing. The bone is ivory pale against the dark clay, small ridges visible where tendons once attached. Tommy has never seen a human skeleton outside of a biology classroom, but there's no mistaking what he's looking at.
The hand is partially articulated, fingers curled as if reaching for something. And on the third finger, still in place after 3 decades underground, a ring. Tommy scrambles backward, his boot heel catching on a tree root. He goes down hard on his tailbone, unable to look away from the pale curve of bone. The ring catches the November light, gold or brass, he can't tell from here, with some kind of engraving visible even through the tarnish. His foreman, Ray Keller, appears at the trench edge, lunch pail in hand. "Chen, you break something down there?" Tommy's voice comes out strangled. "Ray, you better call the sheriff." By 3 o'clock, the site is swarming with people Tommy doesn't know. Sheriff Coleman arrived first, his cruiser kicking up dust on the access road. He took one look into the trench, muttered something under his breath about jurisdiction, and made a call from the radio in his car. Then came the state police. Then someone from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. Then a woman in mud-stained khakis who introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Voss, consulting archaeologist. Tommy sits on the running board of his excavator, drinking terrible coffee from a thermos Ray brought. The backhoe is now surrounded by yellow tape that snaps and flutters in the wind. He's given his statement 3 times already. Dr. Voss descends into the trench with 2 assistants, carrying clipboards and cameras and tools that look like they belong in a dentist's office. She kneels beside the exposed hand, studying it without touching. One of her assistants photographs from multiple angles, the flash stark in the shadow of the trench. Sheriff Coleman stands at the edge, arms folded. He's a thick man in his 60s, with a face weathered by decades of Kansas wind. Tommy has seen him around town, but never spoken to him before today. "How deep you say you were digging?" Coleman calls down. Dr. Voss doesn't look up. "Depth of burial is approximately 7 to 8 feet. Clay layer suggests anaerobic preservation. We'll know more once we excavate properly." "How long's it been down there?" "Hard to say without carbon dating, but judging by the clothing fragments and the style of that ring," she pauses, leaning closer. "I'd estimate at least 25, 30 years, possibly longer." Coleman grunts. "Before my time, then." One of the assistants brushes away more clay near the hand, working with agonizing slowness. Tommy watches from his perch, unable to shake the feeling that he's intruded on something private, something that was meant to stay buried. "Sheriff?" Dr. Voss's voice
Has changed, gone tight. "You're going to want to see this." Coleman descends the ladder they've set up, his boots leaving deep prints in the clay. Dr. Voss points to something just beyond the hand, where her assistant has cleared a small area. A boot. Leather, partially preserved by the same clay that protected the bones. European style, with a distinctive sole pattern and laces still threaded through the eyelets. "Keep going," Coleman says quietly. The assistants work faster now, brushes and trowels revealing more with each careful stroke. The skeleton emerges gradually from the clay, like a shipwreck rising from the seafloor. Ribs, vertebrae, a skull, angled sideways with the jaw hanging open. Tommy watches Dr. Voss lift something from the clay near the skull, a scrap of fabric, rotted but still recognizable. She holds it up to the light. "Wool," she murmurs. "Military grade. And there's something else." Her assistant hands her a small brush. She works at a point just below the collarbone, where the fabric overlay suggests a pocket. After a moment, she extracts a small object, turning it over in her palm. A button. Tarnished metal with an embossed design barely visible through 3 decades of corrosion. Coleman leans in, squinting. Then his face goes pale. "That's a Wehrmacht button," he says. "German army." Dr. Voss nods slowly, still studying the skeleton. "And unless I'm very much mistaken, Sheriff, that ring is Luftwaffe. Officers wore rings as a mark of unit pride." She glances up at Coleman, her expression grave. "I think we just found your German POW." Tommy's coffee goes cold in his hands. He knows the stories. Everyone in Concordia knows them. Camp Concordia, the big POW facility that operated during the war, just a few miles from where they're standing now. Thousands of German soldiers held on Kansas farmland, working in the fields until the war ended, and they shipped them all home. One POW who never made it home. One who disappeared in 1943 and sparked the biggest manhunt in Kansas history. Becker, Coleman breathes. Franz Becker. Son of a bitch was here the whole time. Dr. Voss is already directing her team, expanding the excavation area. They work methodically, photographing every inch, mapping the position of every bone and artifact before disturbing anything. Tommy thinks about the woman who died last month. Sarah something. The one who lived alone in that apartment off Main Street. He remembers seeing the obituary, thinking it was strange how few people came to her funeral. Someone at the diner mentioned she'd been involved in some scandal back during the war, something about helping a Nazi escape. He wonders if anyone told her, before she died, that her Nazi never escaped at all. "Sheriff," Dr. Voss's voice cuts through the evening air, sharper now. "We have a problem." Coleman, who'd climbed back up to the surface, returns to the edge. "What kind of problem?" "There's a second skeleton. The..." Words seem to hang in the cold air. Tommy stands, moves closer to the tape line, needing to see. Dr. Voss's team has expanded their excavation 2 feet to the left, following the curve of what they thought was just disturbed soil. But the soil isn't disturbed. It's another burial, parallel to the first. The assistants are uncovering it now, working faster with the light starting to fade. This skeleton wears different clothes. The fabric is darker, heavier. American cotton, not German wool. And on the skeleton's chest, resting where it fell when the flesh rotted away, is a tarnished metal rectangle on a beaded chain. Dr. Voss lifts it carefully, wipes away the clay with her thumb. She reads the stamped letters aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. Dutton, James R., CPL, U.S. Army. Tommy feels the world tilt. The German POW who vanished in 1943 didn't escape to Argentina or Mexico or anywhere else. He died right here, at Coal Creek, in the exact spot where the bloodhounds lost his scent 30 years ago, and the American guard who reported him missing died right beside him. Sheriff Coleman stands motionless at the trench edge, staring down at the 2 skeletons lying in the clay. After a long moment, he reaches for the radio clipped to his belt. "I need to make a call," he says. "FBI's going to want to know about this." The sun drops below the horizon, and someone sets up work lights that cast harsh shadows across the excavation. Tommy watches from the hood of his truck as more people arrive. County coroner, more state police, someone from the Historical Society who keeps repeating, "Impossible," under his breath. Dr. Voss oversees the careful removal of both skeletons, her team working through the night to preserve every fragment of evidence. They find more buttons, scraps of fabric, a corroded revolver 6 inches from the American's hand, and in the pocket of what used to be a civilian jacket on the German's body, protected by the oilskin lining, a paper packet survived, a yellowed photograph of a young woman, and a folded scrap of paper with a few words written in German. The sheriff's department set up floodlights around the excavation site as dusk settled over the prairie. Tommy Chen stood 20 yards back, arms wrapped tight around his chest, watching the archaeologists work with brushes and tiny trowels. The backhoe sat silent behind him, its bucket still crusted with the clay that had hidden secrets for 30 years. Dr. Patricia Voss knelt at the edge of the shallow grave, her knees sinking into mud that smelled of iron and time. The skeletal hand she'd uncovered hours earlier now connected to a complete ulna, radius, the delicate architecture of a wrist. The Luftwaffe ring caught the harsh white light, its engraved eagle still visible beneath 3 decades of tarnish. "Careful here," she murmured to her graduate assistant, a lanky kid from Kansas State who'd gone pale when the skull emerged. The clay preserved more than I expected. Sheriff Coleman shifted his weight from boot to boot, chewing an unlit cigar. "How much longer?" "As long as it takes." Patricia didn't look up. Her brush whispered across bone, revealing the curve of a clavicle. Scraps of fabric clung to the skeleton, dark wool, rotted but recognizable. A corroded button bore the faint outline of an eagle and swastika. Behind her, a state police photographer documented every inch. His flash strobed across the creek bed, freezing moments in bursts of light. Flash, the skull's empty sockets staring upward. Flash, the skeletal fingers positioned as if reaching. Flash, the European-style boot that matched the partial print found here 30 years ago, when bloodhounds lost Franz Becker's trail. Tommy lit his third cigarette of the hour. His hands still shook. "I almost broke right through him," he said to no one in particular. "Another 6 inches and the bucket would have, but you didn't." Ray Keller, his foreman, stood beside him in silence. They'd both seen plenty digging foundations across Kansas. The occasional arrowhead, old farming equipment, once a Model T Ford buried in a barn collapse. Never this. Patricia's assistant made a sound in his throat. "Dr. Voss." She followed his pointing finger. 2 feet from Becker's remains, the clay showed a different texture, darker, denser. She moved carefully, testing the ground with her trowel before applying pressure. "More bone." The sheriff leaned forward. "That part of the same one?" Patricia shook her head slowly. The new skeleton lay parallel to Becker's, positioned as if the 2 men had been buried side by side. Her brush revealed fabric, different from the German wool. This cloth was olive drab, American military issue, though decades of moisture had reduced it to ribbons. She worked faster now, her academic caution giving way to urgency. The second skull emerged, its jaw slightly askew. The skeleton's right arm crossed its chest in a position that suggested the body had been dumped rather than laid out. "Get more light over here," she called. 2 troopers angled portable floods toward the new grave. The white light turned the creek bed into an operating theater, every detail harsh and undeniable. Patricia brushed clay from the second skeleton's upper torso, revealing the unmistakable curve of ribs. Something metallic glinted near the clavicle. She used a smaller brush, barely breathing. The object emerged slowly, rectangular, corroded, stamped letters fighting through 3 decades of oxidation. Her assistant leaned close with a magnifying glass and LED pen light. "It's a dog tag," he whispered. Patricia lifted it with tweezers, cradling it in her palm. Dirt flaked away as she angled it toward the light. The stamped letters emerged one by one, fighting through rust. CPL, James R. Dutton. The sheriff's cigar dropped from his mouth. "Jesus Christ," he said. "That's the guard, the one who reported Becker missing." Patricia placed the dog tag in an evidence bag with hands that had steadied through years of fieldwork but trembled now. She looked from one skeleton to the other, the German officer and the American corporal, buried together in Kansas clay while the world above them moved on. "They've been here the whole time," she said quietly. "Both of them, right where the bloodhounds stopped." Behind the floodlights, Tommy Chen sank onto the backhoe's track. He'd lived in Cloud County his whole life, grown up on stories about the war, the POW camp, the famous escape. His grandmother used to point toward Coal Creek and tell him about the dangerous German who vanished into thin air, probably living it up in South America while decent folks struggled. "He never left," Tommy said. "All those years, all that searching, he was right here." Sheriff Coleman walked to his cruiser and radioed the FBI field office in Topeka. His voice carried across the excavation site, clipped and official, reporting a discovery that would rewrite 30 years of accepted history. Patricia continued working as darkness deepened beyond the lights. Her team documented every detail, the position of the bodies, the spacing between them, the scattering of artifacts. The corroded revolver lay 18 inches from Dutton's right hand. Scraps of civilian clothing clung to Becker's skeleton, confirming he'd changed from his prison uniform before whatever happened here. A state police evidence tech bagged soil samples while another sketched the scene. The photographer's flash continued its rhythm, building a visual record that would be scrutinized in courtrooms and congressional hearings. "Dr. Voss," her assistant pointed to Becker's skull. "Look at the base."
She angled her light carefully. The occipital bone showed a catastrophic fracture, not the clean break of a fall, but the starred pattern of violent impact. She'd seen similar trauma in remains from medieval battlefields, modern homicides, anywhere human beings decided to end each other. Blunt force, she said. Significant. This would have been fatal. So he didn't escape. The assistant stated the obvious because someone had to. He died right here, 30 years ago, while everyone was searching for him. Patricia sat back on her heels, looking at the two skeletons illuminated by artificial light under the vast Kansas sky. Somewhere overhead, jets from Forbes Air Force Base traced contrails toward Strategic Air Command exercises. The modern world hummed with its wars and its certainties. But here, in the mud, two men waited to tell a different story. Sheriff Coleman returned from his cruiser. FBI is sending someone from Topeka. Should be here in 2 hours. He looked at the graves. This changes everything, doesn't it? Everything, Patricia agreed. Tommy finished his cigarette and lit another immediately. He thought about Sarah Mitchell, the quiet old woman who died last month. He'd driven past her house 100 times, never speaking to her, knowing only that she'd done something shameful during the war, something involving the escaped German. That woman, he said to Ray. Sarah. She went to prison for helping him escape. Yeah, Ray's voice was heavy. She did 4 years, but if he never left, then she went to prison for nothing. Ray shook his head. Died thinking everyone was right about her. Died thinking he abandoned her. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of turned earth and coming winter. In 3 weeks, this entire valley would be underwater, the new reservoir filling from Coal Creek's diverted flow. The timing felt intentional, cosmically cruel. 30 years of silence broken only because progress demanded flooding this particular stretch of prairie. Patricia's team worked through the night, racing against the construction schedule. By dawn, they'd documented everything, photographed every angle, bagged every artifact. The skeletons themselves would go to the state forensic lab in Topeka for detailed analysis. As the sun broke over the eastern horizon, turning the prairie gold, Patricia stood and stretched muscles that ached from hours of kneeling. The grave looked smaller now, emptied of its long-kept secrets. Just a depression in clay, soon to be covered by 40 feet of water. She picked up the evidence bag containing Dutton's dog tag and turned it in the early light. A corporal from Kansas, probably drafted, probably just trying to do his duty, and a German officer, decorated Luftwaffe pilot, prisoner of war, both ending here, together, while the machinery of investigation and justice ground forward on the wrong trail entirely. What happened to you two? She asked the empty grave. The prairie wind offered no answers, but somewhere in Topeka, in dusty filing cabinets and forgotten archives, those answers waited. Someone would find them now. Someone would have to. Tommy Chen climbed back into his backhoe as the archaeologists packed their equipment. The construction schedule allowed no time for reflection. The reservoir project continued, deadline unchanged. But as he guided his machine away from the excavation site, Tommy looked back once. In the rising sun, the two graves looked like open mouths, finally able to speak after 30 years of enforced silence. Whatever they had to say, the whole world was about to listen. The FBI field office in Topeka hummed with quiet efficiency, typewriters clicking, filing cabinets sliding open and shut, the low murmur of telephone conversations conducting the ordinary business of federal law enforcement. Special Agent Richard Miller sat at a borrowed desk in the basement archives, a space that smelled of mildew and forgotten paper, where the Bureau stored cases too old for active investigation, but too recent for proper historical disposal. The skeletal remains from Coal Creek had arrived at the Kansas Bureau of Investigation Forensics Lab 3 days ago. Miller, 32 and recently transferred from the Bureau's Historical Crimes Unit in Washington, had volunteered to review the original case files. His colleagues considered it a waste of time. The bones were clearly identified, the principals long dead or imprisoned, but Miller had spent 5 years studying cold cases, and he'd learned that the convenient narratives were almost always incomplete. Before him lay 2 neat stacks, the official 1943 investigative file on Hauptmann Franz Becker and the thinner folder documenting Sarah Mitchell's prosecution. Miller opened Becker's file first, scanning the typewritten pages that had yellowed with 3 decades of storage. The initial reports matched what Sheriff Coleman had briefed him on. Becker vanished from the Anderson farm at approximately 14:45 hours on November 17, 1943. Prison uniform found folded in the outhouse. Immediate search initiated. Bloodhounds tracked to Coal Creek, scent lost in water. Working theory: accomplice waiting with civilian clothes and vehicle. Miller flipped through witness statements, his trained eye catching the small inconsistencies that accumulate in any investigation. Most were mundane, times that didn't quite align, descriptions that shifted slightly between tellings. But one made him pause. Emma Anderson, age 16, daughter of Dale Anderson. Statement taken November 19, 1943, 2 days after the disappearance. The handwriting was hurried, the interviewing agent clearly anxious to move on to more promising leads. Emma reported seeing the German officer near Coal Creek on the evening of November 15th, 2 nights before Becker vanished. He was arguing with another man. She couldn't make out words but noted they spoke German. The second man was shorter, broader than Becker. The original investigator had scribbled a note in the margin. Girl prone to imagination per father. Likely saw prisoners during regular work detail. No tactical value. Miller set the statement aside and continued reading. The case file grew thicker as the search expanded. Roadblock reports from 12 counties. Interviews with German sympathizers as far as Wichita. Telegrams to and from the State Department regarding possible routes to Mexico. The investigation radiated outward with impressive thoroughness, consuming resources across the Midwest. Then came the breakthrough, the raid on Sarah Mitchell's apartment. Miller studied the evidence inventory. Forged identity papers for Frank Baker and Sarah Baker. A map with a red-inked route from Concordia south through Oklahoma to the Texas border. $3,000 in cash, wrapped in brown paper, hidden beneath floorboards. Railroad schedules for routes terminating in border towns. It was damning. No wonder the prosecution took less than 4 hours to secure a conviction. Miller opened Sarah's file, thinner but heavier with the weight of presumed guilt. Her testimony, minimal as it was, revealed nothing. She denied involvement. She claimed the money was savings from her work. She had no explanation for the forged documents that satisfied the prosecutors. He found the sentencing transcript. The judge called her actions an inexcusable betrayal during wartime. She served 4 years. Miller closed both files and sat back, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles. Something nagged at him, a wrongness he couldn't yet articulate. The official narrative was elegantly simple. Becker escaped with help from a lovesick translator, likely reached Mexico, possibly Argentina. Case closed. Subject at large but presumed beyond extradition. Except Franz Becker never left Coal Creek. His body proved that. And Corporal James Dutton died beside him. Miller pulled out a fresh legal pad and began making notes. He drew a timeline, marking November 15th, Emma's citing of the argument, and November 17th, disappearance. He listed the key players: Becker, Sarah Mitchell, Dutton, the unidentified second German speaker. He returned to the evidence inventory from Sarah's apartment, reading more slowly this time. Something about the $3,000 bothered him. It was a significant sum in 1943, roughly equivalent to 2 years of a translator's salary. Would a woman working a government job really accumulate that much in cash? Unless it wasn't just her money. Miller flipped through the POW camp payroll records, included as supporting documentation. Prisoners received 80 cents per day for labor. Becker had been at Camp Concordia for 8 months before his disappearance. If he'd worked consistently and saved every cent, he could have accumulated close to $1,500. Miller wrote a note. $3,000 total equals $1,500 Mitchell plus $1,500 Becker? He turned to Dutton's file, which was surprisingly sparse given that the man died at the same site as the escaped prisoner. The original investigation treated his disappearance as a separate mystery, likely murdered while trying to apprehend Becker. There was a brief biography. 27 years old, local Kansas boy, enlisted 1942, assigned to Camp Concordia in March 1943. Then Miller found it, buried in a background check conducted after Dutton's disappearance. The corporal had accumulated debts totaling nearly $800 from poker games at an off-base establishment in Salina. The investigator noted Dutton had been increasingly anxious about money in the weeks before November 17th. Miller drew a line connecting Dutton to the $3,000. He drew another line, this one dotted and uncertain, from Dutton to the unidentified German speaker Emma Anderson saw arguing with Becker. The phone on the corner desk rang. Miller ignored it, focused now on the gap between what the original investigators wanted to find and what the evidence actually suggested. He pulled the witness statements again, reading each one completely this time. Most came from other guards, local farmers, POWs who spoke English well enough to be interviewed.
The pattern became clear. Everyone asked about escape routes, accomplices outside the camp, German sympathizer networks. Almost no one asked about conflicts inside the camp. Almost no one except a young FBI agent named Martin Cross, who'd interviewed several German prisoners in December 1943. Miller found Cross's reports near the back of the file. They were detailed, careful, and completely ignored by the lead investigators. Cross had spoken with 5 POWs who knew Becker well. 3 provided only basic information. 1 was hostile and refused to cooperate. The 5th was Hans Weber. Miller read Cross's notes slowly. Weber, age 30, Luftwaffe enlisted man, captured alongside Becker in North Africa. The two were childhood friends from the same Hamburg neighborhood. Weber had been extremely agitated during the interview, repeatedly referring to Becker as a traitor and corrupted by the Americans. Cross had noted, subject became catatonic mid-interview when asked if he knew Becker's location, would not respond to questions for remainder of session, appeared to enter fugue state, recommend psychiatric evaluation. A follow-up note, dated 2 weeks later, subject Hans Weber remains non-responsive. Camp physician suggests acute dissociative episode possibly triggered by stress of capture and imprisonment. Recommend repatriation to appropriate facility. Miller set the papers down and walked to the basement window, looking out at ground level where dead leaves blew across the parking lot. The November afternoon was fading toward dusk. He thought about Emma Anderson seeing 2 German speakers argue, about Dutton's gambling debts, about $3,000 that could have bought cooperation, about Hans Weber calling his childhood friend a traitor, then retreating into silence so complete he couldn't function. The official story, the convenient story, was that Becker escaped, that Sarah Mitchell helped him, that Corporal Dutton tried to stop him and paid with his life. But what if the truth was simpler and darker? What if Becker never intended to escape at all? Miller returned to his desk and picked up the phone, dialing the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. The forensics examiner answered on the 3rd ring. "This is Agent Miller, FBI. I need the complete autopsy reports on the Coal Creek remains as soon as they're ready." "Should have preliminary findings tomorrow," the examiner said. "Cause of death looks straightforward on the German. Massive blunt force trauma to the skull. The American's going to take longer. No obvious fatal wound on the bones themselves. What about the revolver found at the scene? Corroded but intact. We're cleaning it now for ballistics and registration checks." "Put a priority on the registration," Miller said. "I need to know whose weapon that was." He hung up and stood, gathering the files into his briefcase. The archive basement had grown dark around him, but he knew where he needed to go next. Somewhere in this building were the current status files on repatriated prisoners of war. If Hans Weber had been sent back to Germany, there would be records, transfer documents, maybe even follow-up reports on his psychiatric condition.
Miller climbed the stairs to the main floor, where fluorescent lights hummed over mostly empty desks. The night shift was thin. Just a few agents finishing paperwork, a receptionist organizing files. He found the repatriation records in a locked cabinet on the third floor. It took him 20 minutes of searching before he located Weber's file. The German had been transferred to a psychiatric facility in Hamburg in February 1946, deemed unfit for normal repatriation processing. The American military hospital that evaluated him noted persistent catatonic state, unresponsive to treatment, prognosis poor. The last entry was dated March 1952. Subject deceased. Natural causes attributed to complications from self-starvation and dehydration. No family contacted. Attached was a single-page inventory of Weber's personal effects, surrendered to German authorities upon his death. Most items were mundane: a few photographs, letters from his mother, a small Bible. But at the bottom of the list, one journal sealed per subject's final written request, to be opened only by official inquiry. Miller stared at the notation. A sealed journal, held for 21 years. He checked his watch. Nearly 6 in the evening. The State Department liaison office would be closed, but he could leave a message requesting contact with German authorities first thing in the morning and asking that the sealed journal be made available to any authorized investigator. The warrant arrived on a Tuesday, brittle November light slanting through Agent Miller's office window in Topeka. He held the court order like a relic, feeling the weight of 3 decades pressing through the paper. Sarah Mitchell's last apartment still stood on a quiet street in Concordia, a narrow 2-story rental with faded green shutters that nobody had disturbed since her death in 1968. Miller made the drive in silence, watching the Kansas prairie roll past under a sky the color of old pewter. The landlord, a stooped man named Vernon Hodge, met him at the curb. His hands shook slightly as he worked the lock. "Nobody's been up there," Vernon said, climbing the narrow stairs ahead of Miller. "Figured her boy would come for the things, but he never did. Place has been sealed since she passed. The apartment smelled of dust and abandonment. Miller's shoes left prints on the warped floorboards. A bare bulb hung from a cord in the living room, casting shadows that seemed to remember Sarah Mitchell's last lonely years. But Miller wasn't interested in the living room. "Attic access?" he asked. Vernon pointed to a ceiling hatch in the bedroom closet. Miller pulled down the folding ladder, the hinges screaming after years of disuse. The beam from his flashlight cut through darkness thick as velvet, illuminating cardboard boxes, a dress form draped in sheets, and a steamer trunk pushed against the far wall. The trunk was locked. Miller worked the clasp with a screwdriver until it gave way with a soft click. Inside lay folded linens, a wedding dress yellowed with age, and photograph albums bound in cracked leather. Miller lifted each layer carefully, methodical as an archaeologist. His fingers found the false bottom on the third pass, a thin panel of wood that shifted when pressed. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, letters, dozens of them. Miller carried the bundle down the ladder and spread the pages across Sarah's old kitchen table. The writing was meticulous, cramped, dense with symbols that looked like German but weren't quite. Some sort of cipher. His pulse quickened. He photographed each page with his department-issue camera, the flash powder smell mingling with the apartment's stale air. "Find what you needed?" Vernon asked from the doorway, nervous. "I found something," Miller said. Back in Topeka, he delivered the photographs to the Bureau's cryptology division, a basement office staffed by a woman named Eleanor Cross, who'd broken Japanese naval codes during the war. She looked at the letters through thick glasses, her expression shifting from curiosity to fascination. "This is a substitution cipher," she said, "but layered. German base language, English phonetic overlay, with what looks like, yes, a book code embedded in the structure. Clever." "How long?" Miller asked. Eleanor smiled without humor. "Give me a week, maybe less if I skip sleeping."
Miller spent that week chasing other threads. He filed requests with the German Federal Archives for Hans Weber's complete psychiatric records. He interviewed Tommy Chen again, walked the site at Coal Creek before the reservoir swallowed it completely, and sat through 3 viewings of the original FBI interrogation footage of Sarah Mitchell. Each time, her face broke his heart a little more. The stubborn silence, the way her hands never stopped moving in her lap. She died believing Becker abandoned her. On the 6th day, Eleanor called him back to her office. "You need to read these," she said, handing him a stack of typewritten translations. Her voice was quiet. All of it. Miller sat down and began. The first letter was dated July 1943, 4 months before Becker's disappearance. "My dearest Sarah, I write this in a code you cannot read, but perhaps someday you will understand why I could not speak these truths aloud. I am not the man this uniform says I am. Germany will lose this war. I have known this since Tobruk, since I watched good men die for a madman's dream. You asked me once what I want when the war ends. The truth is simple. I want to live, not as a soldier, not as a prisoner. Just a man, perhaps with a small house and work that builds instead of destroys. I want to live with you." Miller's hands trembled. He kept reading. The letters documented everything. Becker's first contact with U.S. intelligence in August, arranged through a sympathetic camp doctor, his careful sharing of information about POW resistance networks, coded messages prisoners were smuggling back to Germany, plans for sabotage if the prisoners were ever released. In exchange, a promise of asylum, a new identity, a future. And woven through every letter, love for Sarah Mitchell, that read like prayer. September 1943. They suspect Sarah. Major Thompson watches us now during every translation session. I must be more careful. But God help me, when you walk into a room, the war disappears. For 2 hours each Tuesday and Thursday, I am simply a man looking at a woman who sees past this uniform to whoever I used to be. October 1943. The money is enough now. $3,000 between us. Your savings and what they have paid me for cooperation. When the time comes, we take the bus to Chicago. New names, new papers, which they will provide. New lives. You will never have to translate another word of German if you do not wish to. Wait for me where the wheat meets the sky. I am coming home. The final coded letter was dated November 15, 1943. 2 days before Becker disappeared. Dearest Sarah, it happens this week, Thursday, November 17th. The details must remain secret even from you. But when you read this, I will already be free. They stage an escape to protect their intelligence operation and my cooperation. By nightfall, I will be in Chicago, and by week's end, you will join me there. Hans suspects something. I see it in how he watches me during roll call, the questions he asks about you. I have told him nothing, but he knows me too well. Childhood friends become the worst enemies when faith turns to suspicion. If anything goes wrong, if you are reading this and I have not returned, know that I tried. Know that every choice I made was to reach you. F. Miller set the pages down. His coffee had gone cold. Hans Weber knew. The phone rang before he could process fully. Germany calling. Agent Miller? The woman's English was precise, clipped. This is Frau Kellerman with the Federal Archives in Koblenz. We have located the materials you requested regarding Hans Weber, deceased 1952, formerly held at the Waldheim Psychiatric Hospital. Can you send them? The file is extensive, but there is one item we can provide immediately, a journal, sealed by hospital staff at his death. We have transcribed the German text. I can cable the translation today. Do it, Miller said.
The cable arrived at 4:47 p.m., transmitted in segments over 2 hours. Miller read it as the pages came off the machine, the clatter of the telegraph keys punctuating each revelation. Most of Weber's journal was incoherent, rambling prayers, accusations against invisible enemies, sketches of wheat fields that dissolved into screaming faces. But the entries from late 1943 were clear, terribly clear. November 10th, 1943. Franz has betrayed everything. I found the letters he hides in the laundry. I cannot read the code, but I know Sarah Mitchell's name. I know the word Chicago. I know he plans to run. He speaks of Germany losing as if it is already decided. He speaks of building a life here with her while our brothers die in Russia, while the fatherland burns. He is not the Franz I knew in Berlin. That Franz believed. This one has been corrupted by American softness, by a woman's touch, by comfort when he should feel only duty. I must save him from himself. God has shown me the way. November 16, 1943. Tomorrow. I have convinced the American corporal, Dutton, the weak one with gambling debts, to help stage Franz's escape. I told him Franz will pay him $3,000 to look away, to report the uniform in the outhouse, to delay the alarm. But Franz will not run. Franz will come to Coal Creek where I will be waiting, and there I will give him the mercy he has earned. A traitor's death for a traitor's choice. If I cannot have the Franz who led us, then no one can have the hollow man he has become. The final entry was dated days after Weber's catatonic state began, scrawled in handwriting that deteriorated into illegibility. November 23, 1943. I waited at the creek as planned. He came in civilian clothes, carrying a single bag, smiling as if freedom already touched him. I stepped from the trees. I showed him Dutton's revolver. "Hans," he said. "Just my name, like I was the betrayer." I told him what he was, what he had become. He did not deny it. He said, "You do not understand love," as if love justified treason, as if love excused abandoning everything we believed. I pulled the trigger, but my hand shook. The shot went wide. He ran. I caught him at the water. We fought in the mud, and God forgive me. The rock was in my hand, and his skull broke like pottery, and he stopped moving, and Dutton came running. He saw what I had done. He tried to take the gun. Weak American. Weak, corrupt American, who sold his duty for money. I strangled him with my hands. It felt like justice. I buried them together in the clay. The ground was soft from rain. No one saw. No one knew. No one knew. I killed the only God I ever believed in, and the man who tried to save him. Now there is nothing, only silence, only wheat and sky, and the certain knowledge that I am damned. Miller sat in the quiet office as the November dark pressed against the windows. He thought of Sarah Mitchell, dying alone, branded a traitor, clutching a photograph of a man buried 3 miles from her apartment. He thought of Franz Becker, trying to defect, to love, to simply live. The FBI cryptologist leaned back from her desk, rubbing her eyes. It was past midnight in the Topeka field office, and Eleanor Cross had been staring at Franz Becker's coded letters for 6 straight hours. The breakthrough came suddenly, the way they always did, a pattern emerging from chaos, a substitution cipher layered with German military shorthand. "Agent Miller," she called out, "you need to see this." Richard Miller appeared in her doorway, coffee in hand, eyes red from his own late-night reading of case files. He'd been cross-referencing Corporal Dutton's service record with the original investigation notes, looking for the seams where the official story had been stitched together too neatly. Eleanor handed him the first translated page. "These aren't escape plans. They're love letters." Miller read standing up,
his coffee going cold in his hand. My dearest Sarah, I write this knowing the risk, but silence has become unbearable. You asked me why I learn your poets, your songs, your strange Kansas expressions. The answer is simple. I am learning the language of the only home I have left. Germany is dying. I know this as certainly as I know the sound of your voice. What comes after will not want men like me, men who believed too easily, who followed orders too well. There is no returning to what I was. Captain Reynolds visited again yesterday. He speaks to me of prisoner exchanges, intelligence networks, names and places. He does not say the word defection, but it hangs between us like smoke. He promises papers, a new identity, asylum after the war ends. He asks only that I continue to report on the more fanatical elements among my men. I have agreed. Not for America's sake, forgive my honesty, but for ours. When this madness ends, I want to be Franz Becker again, but a different Franz, one who builds things instead of destroying them, one who wakes beside you in that little house you described, where the wheat fields touch the horizon. Hans suspects something. I see it in how he watches me during roll call, how he falls silent when I enter the barracks. His faith has always been absolute, first in the Führer, then in me when I told him such faith was misplaced. If he learns what I am doing, what I have become in his eyes, I fear what his righteousness might demand. Forgive the melodrama. The late hour makes philosophers of us all. I love you. This I know with the same certainty I know Germany's fate. Wait for me. Forever yours, Franz. Miller set the page down carefully. When was this written? October 23, 1943. Eleanor shuffled through her translations. 3 weeks before he disappeared. And there are more. Here. The next letter was shorter, more urgent. Sarah, it is arranged. November 17th. The Anderson farm detail as planned. James has agreed. Poor fool, his debts have made him desperate, and I have made him promises I pray I can keep. He will report me missing from the work detail. I will leave my uniform as evidence of escape. You must call in sick that day. Go nowhere near the camp. When the search begins, let them find the forged papers, the maps, the money we've saved together. It will look like you helped me flee to Mexico. You will be questioned, perhaps even charged. But Reynolds promises his people will intervene within weeks. The appearance of guilt protects you from the deeper truth. By the time they clear your name, I will be Franz Mueller, engineering consultant, and you will be my wife. We will build our life somewhere wheat grows and the sky goes on forever. Reynolds has promised transport from Coal Creek to a safe house in Kansas City. From there, new papers, new names, new lives. By Christmas, this will be memory. I am terrified, my love, not of the Americans or their justice, but that I have miscalculated, that my faith in Reynolds is as misplaced as my faith in Germany once was, that you will wait for a man who never comes. Trust me, 3 more weeks, then we will be free. F. Miller sat down heavily. Jesus Christ, he wasn't escaping. He was defecting with our help. There's one more. Eleanor's voice had gone quiet. Dated November 15th, 2 days before. Sarah, Hans knows. I saw it in his face during evening formation. That look, I have seen it before, in the eyes of men about to do something terrible in the name of righteousness. He cornered me after count, asked me in German if the rumors were true. They say you give the Americans names, he said. They say you have forgotten what we are fighting for. I denied it. But Hans has known me since we were boys. He knows when I lie. I cannot postpone. The plan proceeds as scheduled. James will be at the Anderson farm. Reynolds's people will be waiting at Coal Creek. But I fear now that someone else will be waiting too. If something goes wrong, if I do not reach Kansas City, you must know this was not abandonment. You must know I tried. I love you with all that remains of my soul. Wait for me where the wheat meets the sky. I am coming home. Franz. The office fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Miller stood and walked to the window, looking out over Topeka's sleeping streets. In the reflection, he could see Eleanor watching him, waiting. "What about Hans Weber's journal?" she asked finally. "The German sent it over?" "This afternoon." Miller returned to the desk and pulled a file from his briefcase. Inside were photocopies of handwritten pages in precise, angular German script, along with an English translation prepared by the German Federal Archives. The entries from November 1943 they're a confession. He found the relevant pages and read aloud. November 16, 1943. Intercepted another of his letters today. Franz thinks he is clever, hiding them in the carpentry shop. But I have been watching. I know every place he goes, every American he speaks to. The words made me physically ill. Defection, asylum, new identity. My brother in all but blood, the finest officer I have known, reduced to a coward who betrays his nation for a woman. I prayed for guidance. The answer came clearly. God does not forgive treason, and neither can I. If Franz will not honor his oath, then I must honor it for him. I must save him from himself, even if it means ending what he has become. I spoke with Dutton tonight. The American is weak. Gambling debts have made him desperate. I offered him half of Sarah's money, the $3,000 Franz mentioned in his letters. Dutton thinks we are helping Franz escape. He does not know I plan to deliver a different kind of freedom. Tomorrow, at Coal Creek, I will give Franz what he cannot give himself, a soldier's death. Better to die honorable than live corrupted. The Americans will believe he escaped. Sarah will grieve but remain free. And I will have saved the only man I ever called brother from the ultimate dishonor. This is love. This is duty. May God forgive me for what tomorrow requires. Eleanor Cross had gone pale. He planned it. He actually wrote down that he planned to murder him. It gets worse. Miller flipped to the next entry, dated November 18th, one day after Becker's disappearance. I cannot write what happened. My hands shake so badly I can barely hold the pen. But I must record it, or go mad with the weight. Franz came to Coal Creek as planned, wearing the civilian clothes Dutton had hidden for him. He smiled when he saw me waiting in the trees. He thought I was there to say goodbye. I told him I knew everything. His cooperation with Reynolds, his plans to betray us, his letters to Sarah, filled with weak sentiment and weaker promises. I expected shame. Instead, he looked at me with pity. "Hans," he said, "the war is lost. What we believed was a lie. You can come with me. There's room in the plan for both of us. We can start again." I shot at him. Dutton's revolver, which I had stolen earlier. But my hands shook and the bullet went wide. Franz tried to run. I caught him at the creek bank. The rock was in my hand before I knew I had picked it up. One blow, then another. Then I could not stop until Dutton pulled me off, screaming, "Jesus Christ, what have you done?" Franz was not dead yet. His eyes found mine. He said, "I forgive you, Hans." Then nothing. Dutton went mad. He grabbed for the revolver, saying he would report everything, that this was murder, not duty. We struggled in the mud. The man was larger than me, but I had God's strength. I felt his throat collapse beneath my hands. I felt his life leave. I buried them together in the soft clay. Two bodies, one who betrayed everything, one who tried to save him. Now I am alone with what I have done. I killed the only God I ever believed in, and the man who tried to save him. Miller closed the file. That's the last coherent entry. Everything after is religious delusions and fragments. He died in a German psychiatric hospital in 1952, still catatonic, still convinced he'd done the right thing. Eleanor stood and walked to her desk, then turned back. Sarah Mitchell served 4 years in prison for helping a man escape. But he never escaped. He was murdered 3 miles from camp by the friend who worshipped him. And she died in 1968 thinking he'd
abandoned her. Miller's voice had gone hollow, thinking the man she loved had made it to Mexico, to Argentina, to freedom, thinking he'd chosen to leave her behind. Can we prove all this? Eleanor gestured at the translated letters. For the official report? Miller nodded. Forensics came back an hour before you called me in here. Becker's skull fracture is consistent with blunt force trauma from a rounded object. A river rock, most likely. Dutton's hyoid bone was fractured, indicating strangulation. The corroded revolver found at the scene matches Dutton's service weapon, reported missing the day after Becker failed to return from his work detail. He sat back in his chair, folding his hands over the files as if to hold them together. We can prove it. It won't change what happened to them, but it will change what the record says. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Outside, the night was thin and quiet. Inside the office, 2 pages of translated handwriting and 1 torn, fevered journal were enough to unravel a lie that had stood for decades. They would reopen the case. They would tell the truth, however late. The journal pages crumble under Miller's gloved fingertips. The paper, brittle, yellowed, arrived from Hamburg in a sealed diplomatic pouch, handled by at least 6 officials before reaching his desk in Topeka. German archivists included a note. Psychiatric records, Hans Weber. Deceased, 1952. Released per treaty protocols. The early entries are mundane. Weather observations, food complaints, a laborer's accounting of small indignities, cold showers, tasteless bread, the monotony of captivity. Weber's handwriting is precise, mechanical, the script of someone trained to record facts without embellishment. Then the tone shifts. October 1943. I saw him with the American woman today near the translation office. The way he looks at her is the way he used to look at the stars when we were boys, when he believed we would conquer them all. She has poisoned him with softness. Miller turns the page. The entries quicken, tighter, harder. November 3rd. He speaks English more than German now. He laughs at their jokes. Yesterday I heard him call the Major Robert like they are friends, like we have not lost brothers to these people. November 10th. I found the letters, hidden in the lining of his jacket during laundry detail. Code. I broke it easily. We used the same cipher as boys for secret messages. He plans to betray everything, to stay here, to become one of them. Miller's chest tightens. He imagines Weber hunched in his bunk after lights out, deciphering Franz's love letters by moonlight, the faith of 30 years cracking like ice. November 15th. There is only one way to save him. If he will not honor himself, I must honor him. God forgive me, but this is love. The handwriting deteriorates. Words slant downward. Ink blots stain the margins. November 17th. It is done. I told the American guard, Dutton, that Franz had more money hidden at the creek. Dutton wanted it, the weak, greedy fool. He brought his revolver in case Franz resisted, but it was I who waited there instead. Miller forces himself to read slowly, to absorb every detail. Eleanor Cross stands behind him now, silent, her breathing shallow. Franz came at sunset. He wore civilian clothes the woman bought him. He smiled when he saw me. He actually smiled. "Hans," he said, "what are you doing here?" I told him I knew, that I had read everything, that he had become something unworthy of the uniform he once wore with pride. He did not deny it. He only said he loved her, that Germany had already lost the war, that staying was not betrayal but survival. He reached for me. He called me brother. I struck him. The rock was smooth, heavy. His skull made a sound like an egg. He fell without understanding why.
Eleanor's hand covers her mouth. Dutton arrived then. He saw Franz on the ground, the blood. He raised his revolver and shouted at me, said he would report this, that he only agreed to help fake an escape, not murder. The fool. The weak American fool who sold out his country for money and then grew a conscience when it was too late. I was faster. I am always faster. The revolver fell. I used my hands. He struggled less than I expected. Soldiers should be stronger. I buried them together in the clay. The creek was low. The earth was soft. Franz's face looked peaceful, like he was sleeping. I told him I was sorry. I told him this was the only way to preserve what he was before she corrupted him. I do not think he heard me. The entry ends. Miller turns the page. The next entries are fragments, unmoored from time. They are calling his name in the camp. They think he escaped. Let them think it. Let him be remembered as the man who outwitted them all, not the traitor who knelt for a woman. I cannot sleep. When I close my eyes, I see the rock in my hand. I see his blood in the water. God has stopped speaking to me. I call out, but hear only wind. Miller flips through weeks of similar repetitions. The handwriting decays further. Sentences trail off mid-thought. Words repeat in frantic loops. Then, a final entry. The last coherent thing Weber ever wrote. February 1944. They are sending me home soon. The doctors say I am unwell. They do not understand. I am the only one who sees clearly. I killed the only God I ever believed in, and the man who tried to save him. Now I am alone with what I have done, and there is no absolution. Not in this life. Not in any life. Franz forgives me or he does not. Either way, I can never ask. The page ends. Miller closes the journal. His hands are shaking. Sweet Jesus, Eleanor whispers. The office is too quiet. Outside, traffic hums along Kansas Avenue. Somewhere a siren wails. The normal world spins on, indifferent. Miller stands, walks to the window. The Topeka skyline glows in the late afternoon sun. 30 years ago, Sarah Mitchell sat in a courtroom 17 blocks from here, convicted of treason, her life gutted by a lie. She died never knowing Franz had loved her until the end, that he had meant to come home, that he was murdered 3 miles from her door by the man who loved him most. We need to confirm the forensics match Weber's account, Miller says finally. His voice is hoarse. Blunt force trauma to Becker's skull, strangulation marks on Dutton. Already done, Eleanor says. She hands him a manila folder. Report came in this morning. Becker's skull fracture is consistent with a rounded, heavy object, likely a river rock. Dutton's hyoid bone was shattered. Manual strangulation, considerable force. Time of death for both, late 1943, early winter, based on soil samples and fabric decay. Miller scans the findings. Every detail aligns. The revolver found at the site was indeed Dutton's service weapon, serial number matched to camp records. Ballistics show it was fired once, the shot Weber described, the one that missed. We have motive, means, confession, Eleanor says. It's airtight 30 years too late. Miller tosses the folder onto his desk. Sarah died thinking she'd been abandoned. Becker died thinking he'd have a future. Dutton died because he tried to do the right thing at the worst possible moment. And Weber, he stops, shakes his head. Weber died insane, convinced he'd committed an act of devotion. Eleanor picks up the journal, handles it like a live grenade. What kind of love does this? The kind that can't survive reality, Miller says. Franz was Weber's whole world, his purpose. When that faith broke, he couldn't let it end quietly. He had to burn it down. Miller thinks of the coded letters from Sarah's attic. I will wait for you, Franz wrote. Trust me, we will have a life. Simple promises, made in secret, destroyed by a fanatic unwilling to watch his God become human. We need to notify descendants, Eleanor says. Dutton has a brother in Wichita. Becker might have distant relatives in Germany. And Sarah, Miller adds quietly. She has a son, Robert. He deserves to know his mother wasn't a traitor. Eleanor nods. Press conference? Yes. Full disclosure. She gets her name back. Miller stares at the journal one last time before locking it in the evidence safe. Somewhere in Hamburg, Hans Weber's bones lie in an unmarked psychiatric hospital grave, unvisited, unmourned. No family came to claim him. No one wrote his name on stone. Perhaps that is the only justice available now. Miller gathers the files, the photographs, the translations. Tomorrow he will stand before reporters and rewrite history. He will clear Sarah's name, explain the murder, close the case. But tonight, he sits alone in the office as shadows lengthen, thinking about the things people bury. Bodies, secrets, the unbearable truth of their own choices. 30 years ago, Coal Creek ran shallow and clear. Now, it will vanish beneath 40 feet of reservoir water, the gravesite drowned, inaccessible, a secret the earth can keep forever, except it couldn't. A backhoe broke the surface. Tommy Chen found the hand. The truth clawed its way back into the light. Miller wonders if Franz and Sarah are together now, somewhere beyond the wheat and the sky. He hopes so. He doesn't believe so, but he hopes. The dead deserve at least that much. The press conference room in Topeka's federal building fills with the murmur of reporters and the click of camera shutters. Agent Richard Miller stands at a podium beneath harsh fluorescent lights, a manila folder resting before him. Behind him, enlarged photographs mounted on foam boards show the Coal Creek excavation site, 2 skeletal remains, and archival images of Camp Concordia. He clears his throat. The room quiets. "Thank you for coming," Miller begins, his voice steady despite the weight of what he's about to say. On November 12th, during excavation for the Concordia Irrigation District reservoir, the remains of 2 individuals were discovered in the bed of Coal Creek, approximately 3 miles from the former site of Camp Concordia prisoner of war camp. He pauses, watching pencils scratch across notepads. Through forensic analysis and examination of newly uncovered evidence, the FBI has positively identified these remains as Hauptmann Franz Becker, a German Luftwaffe officer who disappeared from Camp Concordia on November 17, 1943, and Corporal James R. Dutton, a United States Army Guard stationed at the same facility. A reporter from the Kansas City Star raises her hand. Miller nods. Agent Miller, for 30 years the official record stated Becker escaped to South America. Are you saying he never left Kansas? That's correct. Miller's jaw tightens. Hauptmann Becker died on or about November 17, 1943, within hours of his reported disappearance. He was murdered approximately half a mile from where bloodhounds lost his trail. The room erupts. Miller raises a hand, waiting for silence. Our investigation has determined that Becker's disappearance was not an escape attempt. Rather, he was the victim of a premeditated execution, carried out by fellow prisoner of war Hans Weber, with the unwitting initial cooperation of Corporal Dutton. He opens the folder, though he's memorized every word. Evidence recovered from Becker's correspondence indicates he was cooperating with United States intelligence, providing information about resistance networks within the POW population in exchange for post-war asylum. A younger reporter leans forward. What about Sarah Mitchell? She was convicted of... Mrs. Sarah Mitchell was wrongly convicted, Miller says, his voice sharp with controlled anger. She served 4 years in federal prison for aiding an escape that never occurred. The money, documents, and maps found in her possession were intended to facilitate Becker's legitimate defection and their planned life together in the United States. She was not a traitor. She was a woman in love with a man who intended to become an American citizen. He glances at Eleanor Cross, standing near the back wall. She gives him a small nod. This morning, the Attorney General signed a posthumous pardon for Mrs. Mitchell. Her conviction has been vacated and expunged from the record. The FBI formally acknowledges that the original investigation failed to pursue evidence that contradicted the preferred narrative of a successful enemy escape.
"What evidence?" someone calls out. Miller flips to another page. Testimony from Emma Anderson, then 16 years old, who witnessed Becker arguing in German with another man near Coal Creek 2 days before the disappearance. Her statement was dismissed as unreliable. Corporal Dutton's substantial gambling debts, which made him vulnerable to bribery, and most significantly, the psychological breakdown of Hans Weber, which began the day after Becker vanished and was attributed to grief over his friend's escape, rather than what it actually was. Guilt over murder. He pauses, letting the room absorb it. Weber's personal journal, obtained from German psychiatric hospital records, contains a full confession. He discovered Becker's cooperation with American authorities and viewed it as the ultimate betrayal. On November 17th, he ambushed Becker at Coal Creek and killed him with a rock. When Corporal Dutton arrived and attempted to stop the killing, Weber strangled him and buried both bodies. A veteran reporter from the Topeka Capital Journal stands. "How certain are you about this timeline?" "Forensic evidence corroborates every detail," Miller replies. "Becker's skull shows blunt force trauma consistent with a heavy object. Dutton's hyoid bone was fractured, indicating manual strangulation. The service revolver found at the scene was issued to Dutton and had been fired once. The bullet recovered from a nearby tree." Weber's journal describes firing a warning shot before Becker's death. The questions come faster now, overlapping. Miller fields them methodically, professional, but weary. When he mentions that Weber died in a German psychiatric facility in 1952, never speaking again after his initial catatonic episode, someone asks about family notifications. Corporal Dutton's younger brother, Raymond, was contacted yesterday at his home in Wichita. "We are attempting to locate any surviving relatives of Hauptmann Becker in Germany." Mrs. Mitchell's son, Robert, was informed this morning. As the conference winds down, a woman from a Concordia weekly raises her hand. "Agent Miller, I grew up hearing stories about Sarah Mitchell. Everyone thought she was a Nazi sympathizer. How do we tell a whole town they were wrong for 30 years? Miller looks directly at her. "You tell them the truth. You tell them that Sarah Mitchell loved a man who wanted to build a life in America, and she died, believing he'd abandoned her. You tell them she spent 3 decades as an outcast for a crime she didn't commit. And you tell them that sometimes the simplest explanation isn't the right one. It's just the most convenient." The room falls silent. Miller gathers his folder. "That's all for now. Written statements will be available within the hour." Later, as the sun sinks toward the western horizon, Miller drives alone down Highway 81 toward Concordia. Eleanor offered to come, but he needs to do this part himself. The town appears unchanged from his previous visits. Grain elevators rising against the sky, modest houses with porches facing tree-lined streets, the stubborn persistence of small-town Kansas. He parks outside the cemetery on the north edge of town, where Patricia Crenshaw told him Sarah was buried. The grass is brown and dormant, waiting for spring. Miller walks past rows of weathered headstones until he finds the simple marker. Sarah Mitchell Crenshaw, 1909 to 1968, beloved mother. No mention of her first husband, killed at Anzio. No reference to her wartime service. Just the years that bracket a life most people remember only for scandal. Miller crouches, brushing dead leaves from the base of the stone. "We found him," he says quietly. "He never left. He was trying to come home to you." The wind moves through the bare branches overhead, carrying the scent of turned earth and coming winter. Somewhere across town, the reservoir project continues its steady work. In a few weeks, Coal Creek will disappear beneath 40 feet of water. But first, there's one more thing. Miller drives to the site as daylight fades. The excavation area is cordoned off, waiting for final surveys before the valley floods. He parks at the access road and walks the quarter-mile to where yellow tape marks the grave's location. The hole has been backfilled now,
the bones safely catalogued in the Topeka lab, but Miller knows exactly where they lay. Two men who died in a struggle neither wanted, victims of loyalty twisted into something poisonous. He carries a small cardboard box, retrieved this morning from the evidence locker. Inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue, is the letter. The preservation team did remarkable work. The envelope, pulled from Becker's jacket pocket after 3 decades in wet clay, was waterlogged and fragile as wet paper. But the letter inside, folded and sealed with wax, survived. They dried it, stabilized it, photographed every word. Miller read it a dozen times. Each time felt like witnessing something sacred and unbearably private. He doesn't unfold it now. Instead, he reads from the translation Eleanor typed this morning. My dearest Sarah, by the time you read this, I will have disappeared. Let them think I have fled. It is safer that way, for both of us. The truth is simpler and more dangerous. I am staying. Captain Reynolds has arranged everything. New papers, a new name, a new life. They want what I know
about the others, who resists, who cooperates, who might become a problem after the war. I will give them this because I have seen enough of war, enough of the Reich's madness. I want only peace, and I want you. Meet me November 19th at the station in Chicago. Bring only what you need. We will disappear together into this big, strange country and build something the war cannot touch. I know you fear I am using you, that this is some elaborate escape plan, and you are merely my tool. I cannot prove otherwise with words. I can only say, I have stood in wheat fields that stretch to the horizon, and for the first time since childhood, I felt I could breathe. This land has room for ghosts to become men again. Wait for me, where the wheat meets the sky. I am coming home. Yours always, Franz. Miller refolds the translation, slipping it back into his jacket. The original will be archived, part of the official record. But he wanted it here, at the place where everything ended, before the water rises. The sun touches the horizon, painting the dormant wheat fields in shades of copper and rust. Miller imagines Sarah on November 19, 1943, standing in Union Station in Chicago with a single suitcase, watching every face that passed, waiting, checking the clock, waiting. He imagines her returning to Concordia days later, hope curdling into confusion, then fear, then the slow, terrible acceptance that he wasn't coming, that maybe he never intended to. She died thinking herself abandoned. Miller's hands tighten on the box. She waited, he says to the empty field. She never stopped waiting. The wind picks up, rattling through the dry stalks. In a few weeks, this valley will flood. The creek bed where Becker and Dutton lay for 30 years will disappear beneath the reservoir, becoming a recreation area where families will fish and swim, never knowing what rests below. Miller thinks about monuments and memory, about how history gets written by whoever controls the narrative. For 3 decades, the story was simple. Dangerous German POW escapes with help from a traitorous widow, vanishes into South America. Clean.